He banged on my door at 7 in the morning, red-faced and screaming that my brand-new deck was 3 feet over his property line, and I had until the weekend to tear it down. What George didn't know was that I still had the original 1998 plat survey in my safe. And what that survey revealed wasn't just that my deck was perfectly legal. It was about to flip the entire dispute upside down and cost him his own backyard. Robert is 58, a retired civil engineer who finally built the backyard deck he'd been sketching since his 30s. He thought his only battle would be against the summer heat. But after that knock on his door, he found himself trapped in a property war with a neighbor who wasn't interested in facts, only intimidation. And the paper that would decide everything had been sitting in a dusty safe for over 2 decades. To understand how a quiet retirement spiraled into a legal war, you have to go back 6 months earlier, when Robert first broke ground on that deck. He'd bought the house in 2001, a modest 3-bedroom on a half-acre lot in a suburban cul-de-sac. The property came with something not every homeowner thinks about: a pristine, iron pin-marked boundary line recorded in the county clerk's office, courtesy of a professional land survey from 1998. Robert knew exactly where his land ended and his neighbors began. He'd lived there peacefully for over 20 years, and his relationship with George, the man next door, had always been cordial waves across the fence, small talk about lawn care, nothing deep but nothing hostile. That changed the moment the contractors sank the first post for the deck. Robert had designed it himself, maximizing morning sun while staying well within his own lot. He checked the old survey, measured twice, and left a generous 2-foot buffer from the line just to avoid any confusion. But George didn't see a buffer. He saw an invasion. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning, 6 days into the build. Robert was still in his robe, coffee in hand, when the pounding started. George stood on the front porch, face flushed, a crumpled property map of his own in his fist, one he'd printed from the county website that morning. And before Robert could even say good morning, George was already shouting about 3 feet of stolen land, about how Robert was taking advantage of him, about how this deck was an act of aggression. When Robert calmly offered to show him the 1998 survey, George waved it off. He didn't want to see paperwork. He wanted demolition. Within 48 hours, the threats escalated. George filed a formal complaint with the township zoning office, forcing a temporary stop-work order on the deck construction. He started filming Robert's backyard with his phone from his upstairs window at all hours, documenting what he called the encroachment. He told other neighbors that Robert was a land grabber, someone who thought rules didn't apply to him. The quiet retiree who'd never had a single dispute with anyone suddenly found himself the subject of whispered gossip at mailboxes and suspicious glances across driveways. But here's what George didn't know. Robert wasn't just any retired guy. He was a civil engineer who'd spent 4 decades reading site plans, property plats, and survey documents, the very things George was now using against him. And when the harassment became daily, when Robert found himself dreading the sound of his own doorbell, he did something George hadn't anticipated. He didn't hire a lawyer first. He drove to the county recorder's office, pulled the original 1998 plat survey with its official seal and iron pin coordinates, and then called a licensed surveyor to restake the entire boundary. He was going to prove, with irrefutable evidence, exactly where that line fell. And what the surveyor would discover in the process wasn't just that Robert was right. It was something that would turn George's own property into a liability he never saw coming. The surveyor arrived on a Thursday morning, a calm man named Dennis who had spent 30 years staking boundaries across the county. He carried a tripod, a total station, and a stack of documents that included the original 1998 plat with its stamped seal and recorded coordinates. Robert walked him to the back corner of the lot and pointed to where the old iron pin should be, buried just beneath the grass. They dug down 6 inches, and there it was, still solid, exactly where the map said it would be. Dennis set up his equipment, took measurements, and within an hour had flagged the entire boundary line with bright orange stakes and pink ribbon. Robert's new deck sat a full 2 feet inside his own property. The buffer he designed was real, confirmed, indisputable. George's claim of 3 feet of encroachment was not just wrong, it was impossible. But Robert didn't stop at proving his deck was legal. As Dennis walked the line along the entire backyard, he paused at the far end, near the old wooden shed that George had built 10 years ago. The surveyor measured twice, checked his notes, then turned to Robert with a look that said everything. George's shed didn't sit entirely on George's land. The back corner of that structure jutted 2 feet across the boundary, straight onto Robert's property. The very man screaming about encroachment had been the one encroaching for an entire decade, every single day, without even knowing it. Robert could have laughed. Instead, he took photos of every stake, every flag, and the surveyor's official field notes. Then he walked next door, knocked calmly, and tried one last time to end this like neighbors. He told George the survey was done, that the deck was fully legal, and that he had ironclad proof. He didn't mention the shed. Not yet. He wanted to give George a chance to walk away with dignity. But George didn't want dignity. He wanted a fight. He accused Robert of hearing a biased surveyor, of lying about the pins, of manufacturing evidence. Within 3 days, the stop work order on the deck was lifted by the township after they reviewed the new survey. But George was already contacting a lawyer. He was going to sue. That's when Robert realized this was no longer about a deck. This was about a man who couldn't admit he was wrong, who would rather burn everything down than say 3 words: "I made a mistake." And so Robert made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the dispute. He had the surveyor prepare an official boundary line report, signed and notarized, showing both the deck's legal placement and the shed's encroachment. Then he delivered a copy to George with a simple offer: withdraw the lawsuit threats, stop the harassment, and Robert would grant a written license allowing the shed to remain where it was, free of charge, for as long as George owned the property. All the rage, all the threats, all the filming, and Robert was still willing to let it go. But George's response burned the last bridge. He called the police, claiming property trespass. The officers arrived, looked at the survey, looked at the deck, and left without issuing a single citation. They told George that Robert had every right to be on his own land and suggested he drop the matter. George, humiliated in front of his own Ring doorbell camera, did the opposite. He filed a civil complaint in county court, alleging trespass, adverse possession, and emotional distress, demanding the deck's removal and monetary damages. He was taking Robert to court over land that his own shed was squatting on. That was the moment Robert understood that this couldn't end quietly. The lawsuit meant discovery, depositions, and a formal trial. It meant every inch of property line would be examined under oath. And it meant that the little shed with its 2-foot encroachment was about to become Exhibit A in a case that George himself had initiated. The man who thought he was the victim was marching toward a courtroom where the truth would finally be dragged into the light, whether he liked it or not. The court date was set for March 15th. In the weeks leading up to it, George's behavior became something neighbors still whisper about. He installed a security camera angled not at his own driveway, but directly into Robert's backyard, capturing every moment Robert spent on his own property. He printed flyers accusing Robert of stealing land and stuffed them into mailboxes around the cul-de-sac. He even attempted to rally an HOA meeting that didn't exist. Robert's neighborhood had no homeowners association. Each attempt to manufacture outrage only isolated George further, but he seemed incapable of backing down. The lawsuit was now his entire identity. Robert, meanwhile, prepared like the engineer he was. He assembled a binder with tabs: the original 1998 survey, the new survey with GPS coordinates, photos of the iron pins, time-stamped footage from his own doorbell camera showing George's daily filming and verbal harassment, and the police report from the day officers told George he had no case. He also included a single photograph of George's shed, with a red line drawn precisely 2 feet inside its back wall, the exact boundary that George himself had insisted be measured. That photograph would become the centerpiece of the entire trial. The first shock came during discovery. George's attorney, a man named Clarkson who specialized in property disputes, had initially seemed confident. But when Robert's evidence arrived, the notarized survey, the pin coordinates, the shed encroachment, Clarkson did what any competent lawyer would do. He hired his own independent surveyor to verify the findings. That surveyor, a woman named Mrs. Elaine Park, spent 3 hours on the property with her own equipment. Her report, submitted to the court 2 weeks before trial, confirmed everything Dennis had found. The deck was fully compliant, the shed sat 2.3 feet across the line, and the original 1998 pins had never been disturbed. George's own expert witness had just handed Robert the case. But here's the thing about people who can't admit they're wrong: they don't stop. They just change tactics. George's new argument, filed in a desperate amended complaint, claimed adverse possession. He had used that strip of land, he said, for over 10 years. He'd mowed it, walked on it, treated it as his own. Therefore, according to this legal doctrine, the land was now his. It was a Hail Mary, and it had 3 fatal flaws. First, adverse possession requires hostile and exclusive use, and Robert had never been excluded. He'd simply never had a reason to stand on that exact patch of grass until now. Second, the shed itself was evidence that any use wasn't hostile. It was a mistake born of a poorly placed structure, not a land grab. And third, George had signed a property disclosure when he bought his house in 2013, acknowledging that a survey existed and that he accepted the lot lines as they were. That document alone gutted his claim. The pretrial hearing was brutal. The judge, a veteran named Judge Morrison, asked Clarkson directly, "Does your client have any evidence contradicting the licensed surveyor's determination?" Clarkson had to answer no. The judge then asked why the court was spending time on a case where the plaintiff's own expert agreed with the defendant. Clarkson tried to pivot to harassment claims, but Robert's doorbell footage showed the opposite. It was George who had been doing all the harassing. Each video clip, played one after another, showed George shouting from the fence, pointing his phone at Robert, circling the property. It was an exhibition of self-inflicted wounds. Then came the moment that truly flipped the case. George, under oath, was asked about his shed. "When did you build it?" He said 2010. "Did you have a survey done before construction?" He admitted he had not. "Did you check property lines with the previous owner?" "No." "Did you ever receive notice from the neighbor that the shed was over the line?" This is where George lied. He claimed Robert had never mentioned it before the deck dispute. But Robert then produced a letter, sent certified mail, dated 3 weeks before the lawsuit, offering a free license to keep the shed where it was if George simply dropped the matter. That letter had been ignored. The judge read it aloud. The courtroom fell silent. George's face drained of color. The ruling, when it arrived, was devastating in its clarity. The case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning George could never sue over this boundary again. The court found that George's shed constituted an encroachment that must be remedied within 90 days, at his own expense. And because George had rejected Robert's reasonable offer and forced the matter to trial unnecessarily, the judge awarded Robert his legal fees. The man who had been screaming about stolen land was now ordered to pay for the very fight he started, and to tear down part of his own property while Robert kept his deck exactly as it stood. The 1998 survey, that dusty document Robert had kept for over 2 decades, had not just defended a line, it had drawn one. The morning after the ruling, Robert woke up without an alarm. He made coffee, walked barefoot across his deck, and sat in the chair he'd built with his own hands. The sunrise hit the wood exactly as he'd planned. For the first time in 8 months, there was no camera pointed at him, no neighbor glaring over the fence, no knot in his stomach wondering what fresh accusation would arrive by noon. The judge's order was final. The 90-day clock on George's shed had already started ticking, and the man who had tried to weaponize the legal system had just been disarmed by it. George, however, did not accept defeat quietly. The week after the dismissal, he filed an appeal, a desperate last-ditch motion that his own attorney tried to talk him out of. Clarkson, according to court records, actually withdrew from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. The appellate court rejected the motion in 14 days flat, citing the trial record as abundantly clear. George was now representing himself, filing handwritten motions that the clerk's office stamped and shelved without comment. His security camera, still angled at Robert's yard, captured nothing but empty lawn and the occasional squirrel. The footage was worthless, and the cameras eventually disappeared one weekend without explanation. The shed removal became a neighborhood spectacle. George hired the cheapest contractor he could find, a two-man crew with a battered pickup truck, and they spent 3 weekends dismantling the back portion of the structure. The 2-foot encroachment meant the entire rear wall had to be rebuilt farther back. Neighbors who had once received George's flyers now watched from their windows, with the quiet satisfaction of people who had been fed a lie and later learned the truth. A couple of them even dropped by Robert's house with baked goods and apologies for ever doubting him. One woman, Mrs. Chen from across the street, told Robert she'd found the original flyer in her mailbox and thrown it away before reading it. She said George had always seemed a little off. Robert just nodded and offered her a seat on the deck. The most surprising twist came a month after the shed was moved. Robert received a certified letter from the county assessor's office. During the boundary restaking process, the surveyor had also clarified the official lot dimensions for both properties. It turned out that George's lot was actually 200 square feet smaller than the original developer had advertised back in 1997, a discrepancy that had nothing to do with Robert and everything to do with a faulty original plat that no one had questioned for 25 years. The county was correcting the records, and George's property tax assessment was being adjusted downward. Not by much, but enough. Robert hadn't just won his case. He had inadvertently exposed a paperwork error that had been inflating his neighbor's property taxes for a decade. George, predictably, blamed Robert for that too, but Robert was done absorbing blame. The legal fees were paid. The deck stood, legally and permanently, in exactly the right place. And on the first warm Saturday of June, Robert fired up a charcoal grill, an old Weber he'd restored during the long months of waiting, and invited the neighbors for a cookout. Not the whole cul-de-sac, just the ones who had stayed decent when things got ugly. They ate burgers and potato salad on the deck that George had tried to tear down. The sun set behind the property line that a dusty survey from 1998 had defended without firing a single shot. George's house was visible through the fence, dark windows and silent yard, but nobody mentioned his name. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from being right on paper, not the loud, triumphant kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lets you sleep at night knowing the receipts exist. Robert still has that binder in his safe, alongside the survey. He doesn't plan to need it again. But every morning when he steps onto his deck with a cup of coffee and watches the light stretch across his half-acre, he knows that if another knock ever comes, he won't just open the door. He'll open the safe first. Most neighbor disputes don't end up in a courtroom. They fester in awkward silences over the fence, in passive-aggressive notes left on windshields, in years of simmering resentment that never quite boils over. Robert's story boiled over, but only because he had the one thing most people overlook until it's too late: proof. Not assumptions. Not handshake agreements from 2 owners ago. A piece of paper stamped and pinned to the earth that had been waiting patiently since 1998 for someone to take it seriously. The lesson here isn't just about property lines. It's about what happens when facts collide with feelings, when ego meets evidence. George didn't lose because he was wrong about the land. He lost because he was incapable of hearing the truth, even when it was handed to him on a plat map with GPS coordinates. And that inability cost him a shed, a lawyer, and every ounce of credibility on a quiet cul-de-sac where people still talk about the man who sued his neighbor over a deck he had no right to challenge. If there's a takeaway, it's this: know what's yours, and know where the receipts are. Whether it's a deed, a survey, or a certified letter, the paper always matters more than the shouting. If you've got a property dispute story of your own, or any story where the little guy won with nothing but the truth and a paper trail, we want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. And if this video earned your time, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.